So, the disease rabies is pretty uncommon in the United States. Last year, 5 people died from rabies, and that was actually more than it has been in previous years. 4 of them, it was determined, were due to bats, and 1 from a dog, actually. You know, those are pretty uncommon. The case of the patient bitten by a dog, that actually occurred in the Philippines before he returned to the United States, where he passed away. Folks who were in direct contact with rabid bats, it brings up an interesting question, and that is frequently people who are bitten by bats don't realize that they have been bitten because they can be asleep or the bites can be extremely small and not noticed. So the rule of thumb, as illustrated by this case I'm about to tell you, is that if you live among bats, like they discover a roost in your home, or if you wake up and there's a bat in your room, you need to assume that you have been exposed and bitten, and that the saliva is infected and that you are in trouble.
That's so interesting that you're saying that, because I just read something the other day when I knew you were bringing this case up about the rabies. Yeah. The CDC does recommend that if you find that you were sleeping with a bat somehow, then they automatically suggest you get the rabies vaccination, assuming you were just bitten by a bat and you don't know it.
Right. You have to assume, and they want to, in that case, give you what they call PEP, the post-exposure prophylaxis.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So that is the immunoglobulin plus the series of 4 vaccines, I think, that you get, right? If, however, you're able to capture the lone bat, and then they test it and show that it does not have rabies, then you can avoid that. But you may not want to avoid that.
Because you may not want to capture the bat, right?
Well, but the other reason is that you just might not want the treatment. And that happened to this elderly guy who's actually in his 80s, who's from Illinois. He awoke to find a bat on his neck, and he was offered the series, and he declined it. And he died that horrible death that people with rabies die. You know, it's a terrible progressive thing. And once your symptoms start, it's unrelenting and you're dead within 2 weeks. And the, PEP is not as terrible as it used to be in the bad old days. So it's rare. It still happens, though, and not so much in dogs. We've pretty much eradicated, the rabid dog problem in our country, which is wonderful. So, Lori, you like bats? You find them cute and mysterious and warm and fuzzy?
I love all animals.
Yes, okay.
But that's a really incredible story. Yeah. I mean, you wake up with a bat on your neck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you just assume he bit you and you don't know it.
Yeah.
But
was it really a bat?
Was it really a bat? Maybe it was a bird. I remember as a kid, my parents would take me and my siblings on camping trips. And I remember on one of these trips, we were joined by other campers. And one evening we saw many bats flying about. And this one woman, fellow camper, became hysterical. And especially, she had this fear related to the bats, not about contracting rabies, but worried the bats would fly and get tangled in her hair. So she ran into her tent and wrapped a scarf around her head. And that's what she would do every night on this trip. And you can't ask me, Peter, where I was or anything else about this camping trip because I don't remember. The only thing I remember is that this woman who tried to convince all of us and freaking everyone out, especially the women with long hair, that they should be worried that a bat would get tangled in our hair. Yeah. Peter, remember all the bats that would appear at dusk when we were living in Palm Springs?
Yeah.
There would be not just an occasional bat, but dozens flying above us.
They didn't seem interested in me, but
no,
I was
didn't.
Interested in going into the house whenever that happened.
Yeah, I know you were.
I wasn't really comfortable out.
So there are a lot of misconceptions about rabies. The rabies virus can infect any mammal. The vast majority of rabies cases reported to the CDC each year occur in wild animals like bats, raccoons, skunks, foxes, although any mammal can get rabies, even people. And one big myth is that the rabies in dogs and cats is common. And as you pointed out, it's not. We do not see rabies often in dogs and cats in the United States, and we don't see a lot of it because of public health efforts that began in the 1940s. And that was largely through vaccination programs. So it's extremely rare to encounter rabies in a dog or a cat or any domestic animal, and rabies is even more rare in people. But the interesting thing is the rabies virus has not gone away after thousands of years, so it's still a risk. So efforts to control it still continues. So rabies is a viral disease, and it's most often transmitted through a bite of a rabid animal. So the virus is passed through the saliva from a bite from a rabid animal. And the rabies virus infects the central nervous system, as you mentioned, ultimately causing disease in the brain and progressive neurological problems and invariably death. Peter, I read that rabies has the highest mortality rate, 99.9%. Of any disease on earth. So the key is to get treated right away if you think there's any chance of you being bitten by an animal that has rabies. How do you know if an animal has rabies?
Okay. It is acting aggressively?
The answer is, the correct answer is, you don't know.
Okay.
What you were about to say could be another misconception. People think that all rabid animals are foaming at the mouth and active aggressively, but you really don't know if an animal's rabid just by looking at it. I read that many wild animals who have rabies actually act shy or timid, and that's not the way wild animals normally act, so that's when you want to steer away from them. So what do you do if you get bitten by an animal? Because there's really no way to know if the animal that bit you is rabid. And by the way, you can't just wait it out and take your time and see if you develop symptoms, because if you're bitten by a rabid animal, there are no symptoms at first. Rabies can lay dormant in your body for like 1 to 3 months. This is what they call the incubation period. Symptoms start to appear once the virus travels through your central nervous system and hits your brain. So you might get a fever, but then you start to get these central nervous system symptoms like anxiety, hyperactivity, being easily agitated, inability to sleep. Sounds like us and everyone you know, right? But you might also be confused. You can start to hallucinate. You might salivate more than usual. You might develop a paralysis. You might have difficulty swallowing. And then eventually coma, heart or lung failure, and death. So let's go back to what do you do if you're bitten by a wild animal, or say you're bitten by a domestic animal, a dog, who you know is not vaccinated against the rabies virus, or a dog who you don't know his or her vaccination status. Then your doctor, or say a typical emergency room, would likely treat you to potentially prevent a rabies infection. And that treatment is the rabies vaccine, which you talked about. The important thing to know here is the vaccine is always successful if it's given immediately after exposure to the rabies virus. And like you said, it's called post-exposure rabies vaccination. You'll get 1 dose of this fast-acting rabies immune globulin, and then you get a series of vaccine shots over the next several days. And that is a precaution that I think any ER in the country would take if someone comes in with a bite from an animal that could be carrying rabies. And the reason there's so much caution is that there's not much you can do if you contract the rabies virus and you get rabies. It's almost universally fatal. So the treatment is prevention, essentially.
I feel very agitated.
Hard time sleeping?
Yes.
Irritability?
Yes.
Hyperactivity?
Too many cats in the bed.
You're foaming at the mouth, Peter.